Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. In today's Figure's story, we meet a man who was loved like a savior, hated like a villain, and judged by the world, but rarely understood by God. What happens when a man becomes a symbol before he ever finds peace as a soul? What do you do when the world calls you a freedom fighter and a terrorist, and both masks are too heavy to wear? This isn't a political story, it's a human one. It's about a boy who lost his mother, lost his home, and spent his life trying to replace both with a nation. His name was Yasser Arafat. But before the revolution, before the war, before the suitcases full of secrets and bunkers under siege, he was just a boy at a train station in Jerusalem, waving goodbye to everything he thought he would never forget. Arafat was born in Cairo, but his earliest memories were shaped in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, where he was sent to live with relatives after his mother died when he was just 4 years old. He would never truly speak of her again. But decades later, during the Oslo negotiations, one of his aides walked into his room to find Arafat staring silently at an old envelope. He didn't speak for a while. Then he said quietly, "I have no photograph of her, just her handwriting. This is how I remember what love once looked like." By the time he returned to Cairo in his teens, the world was changing. In 1948, the Nakba arrived. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled their homes. But for young Yasser, the loss was different. It wasn't just land, it was identity. He was stateless. No country claimed him. He belonged to no border. Not even a grave had been left for his mother. He studied engineering, wore second-hand shoes, worked nights to survive. But all the while, he was watching, learning, mourning quietly. He read history like scripture, carried maps in his notebook like prayers. One of his professors once told him, "You have the hands of a builder, but the eyes of someone already building something else." He wasn't wrong. In the late 1950s, Arafat started gathering others like him. Young men without homes, without mothers, without answers. Together, they formed a group with no country and no army, but one vision: Fatah. Their tools were old radios, hand-copied newsletters, secret meetings under street lamps in Kuwait City, where Arafat worked as a civil engineer. He used his paycheck to fund printing leaflets. He kept a list of names folded in his wallet. Every name was someone displaced, detained, or dead. His first operation failed, but he didn't stop, because Yasser Arafat wasn't chasing victory. He was chasing meaning. The world saw him as dangerous, radical, but inside, he was still the boy at the train station, believing somehow that if he kept building something, his mother would see it from heaven and say, "That's my son." By the early 1960s, Yasser Arafat had two things: a growing movement and a target on his back. He wore the same fatigues every day, slept wherever was safe, but he never traveled without two things in his coat pocket: a folded Quran and a tiny sliver of stone from outside his childhood home in Jerusalem. His companions used to tease him. "You carry that rock like it's a holy relic," they'd say. And he would reply, "It's the last place I saw her, my mother. I can't visit her grave, so I carry the soil instead." No speeches, no slogans, just grief, shaped into purpose. The world was changing. Arab nations were busy pointing fingers. The West was aligning with Israel. But Arafat, he didn't wait for the wind to shift. In 1965, Fatah carried out its first official armed operation. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't strategic. It failed, but it was loud. And suddenly, the name Arafat started appearing in intelligence reports, in quiet conversations between presidents, in warnings whispered by spies. Still, Arafat never smiled about it. One night, when asked what he felt about being on the world stage, he answered, "The world only notices you when you carry a gun or a coffin. I'd rather carry a flag, but no one looks at those anymore." In 1967, Israel's victory in the Six-Day War crushed the Arab world, but it also gave Arafat an opportunity, because defeat creates listeners. He stepped forward and said, "We've waited for kings to save us, for armies, for rain that never came. No more." And in 1969, he became chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. He didn't run for it. He didn't beg for it. The people handed it to him like a wound. But leadership came with a new price: diplomacy. He began flying between countries like a man caught in a storm. Beirut, Amman, Damascus, Algiers, Moscow. Sometimes he was treated like a head of state. Other times, like a criminal. He had to become fluent in many things: loyalty, betrayal, silence. He trusted few, loved fewer, and yet he remembered everyone's name, even the janitor in Baghdad who once helped hide him during a raid. Arafat sent him a box of dates every Ramadan until the man died. That was Arafat. Impossible to categorize. Just when you thought you understood him, he would hand you kindness instead of strategy. Still, the blood began to rise. After Black September in Jordan, 1970, when thousands of Palestinians were killed, Arafat sat in stunned silence. His aide found him sitting alone, hands covered in ink, not moving. He whispered, "I carry these people like they are my children, and I just watched half of them die." He didn't sleep for 3 nights, and on the 4th, he got up and said, "If I have to die to stop this from happening again, then let it be soon, but let it be meaningful." By the early 1970s, the world was no longer ignoring Yasser Arafat. To some, he was the voice of the voiceless. To others, a dangerous figure cloaked in symbolism. And to himself, he began to feel like a man being written about in languages he didn't speak. In 1974, an invitation arrived. unexpected, and historic. The United Nations. Arafat was to address the General Assembly. His aides urged him to wear a suit. He tried it on, just once, then took it off. Instead, he walked into the chamber in olive drab, with his keffiyeh wrapped around his shoulder in the shape of historic Palestine. The world stared, and in a voice that shook with both steel and sorrow, he said, "I have come bearing an olive branch in one hand and a freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." That sentence would follow him forever. Some heard it as a threat, others a plea. But the truth? Arafat's hands were tired. Behind the scenes, he was beginning to realize that war may plant flags, but peace builds homes. He started reaching out to old enemies, softly, quietly. But there was a problem. His people were divided. Some saw negotiations as betrayal. Others saw armed resistance as hopeless. And Arafat, he stood in the middle, like a man trying to calm a storm with a whisper. He made a rule. He would never eat before the last of his security team was fed. "Why?" one guard asked. He replied, "Because they'd take a bullet before I even hear the shot. That's more loyalty than most men ever earn." Then came Lebanon. In 1982, Israeli forces invaded to crush the PLO. Arafat's compound in Beirut became a bunker. One night, during a lull in shelling, a young Palestinian fighter approached him. "Why haven't you left? They're targeting this building." Arafat didn't flinch. "If I leave now, I become a refugee again. But if I die here, I die as someone who stood where he said he would." The next morning, after weeks under fire, Arafat agreed to leave Beirut. Not for safety, but for survival of the movement. He boarded a ship to Tunisia, waving from the deck like a man burying a part of his soul at sea. That night, he prayed alone. He asked for one thing: "Let me return before I die. Let my feet touch my land one more time. Let me see a child laugh without fear." And when his aide asked him if he had faith it would happen, Arafat said only, "I don't know if it will, but I pray that God doesn't make my exile my legacy." Exile in Tunisia was not glamorous. Yasser Arafat, once surrounded by roaring crowds, now lived in an apartment ringed with sandbags. No soil, no olive trees, no scent of home. Each morning, he'd open the window, even though it faced only a concrete wall. When asked why, he said, "Because I want the air to know I'm still here." But something began to shift inside him. In the silence of exile, he started dreaming of peace. Not as a tactic, not as a ceasefire, but as something holy. He started reading the Bible again, quietly, not for politics, but because it reminded him of something sacred about the land he had once walked barefoot as a child. He said once to a Swedish diplomat, "I know the verses, I just forgot the mercy behind them. He began to pray, not for victory, but for vision. And when news came that Israeli and Palestinian negotiators had begun talking, secretly, in a forest outside Oslo, Norway, Arafat paused, listened, then said, "Bring me the risk. I will sign with a shaking hand if it means a child can sleep without hearing sirens." The Oslo Accords were unlike anything he had done before. A piece of paper, a promise, a surrender of some dreams, in hopes of rescuing others. In 1993, on the lawn of the White House, he stood across from Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The cameras rolled, the world watched, and then that handshake, two hands, decades of war between them. Arafat's fingers curled tight. He didn't smile, neither did Rabin, because both men knew this was not peace, it was pain, wrapped in a prayer. Later that night, Arafat didn't celebrate. His staff was cheerful, hopeful. He was quiet. He sat alone in his hotel room and stared at a grainy photo on his desk, his childhood home in Jerusalem. He whispered, "I shook a hand today that may save 1,000 children, but I know it may also kill me." He wasn't wrong, because peace has enemies too. The ink on the Oslo Accords was still wet when the first protests erupted in Gaza. Some Palestinians called Arafat a traitor. Others called him a fool. He had spent decades promising return. Now, he was promising restraint. One of his former fighters, now turned critic, shouted on television, "He gave away the dream just to stand in front of cameras." Arafat never responded publicly, but that night, his aide heard him whisper, "They don't see the graves I see. They don't hear the mothers I hear at night." Despite the backlash, he came home. In 1994, Yasser Arafat stepped foot in Gaza for the first time in 27 years. Tens of thousands gathered. People wept. Children climbed trees to glimpse him. Old men clutched faded keys, the symbols of homes they could no longer find. But Arafat didn't cry. He stood still, and as the applause echoed, his voice trembled. "I have missed the soil beneath your feet more than the air in my lungs." He had returned, but Gaza was broken, divided, exhausted. Poverty, corruption, fractured hopes. He tried to lead, to govern, to heal. But leadership now meant dealing with bureaucrats and budgets, not dreams. His heart was still in the battlefield, but the battlefield had changed, and he no longer recognized the rules. Then came 1995. Yitzhak Rabin, the man who shook his hand, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist. The news hit Arafat in the middle of a meeting. He stopped speaking, stared ahead for several seconds, and then quietly said, "I knew I would lose something when I signed. I just didn't know I would lose him. Later, when he laid a wreath at Rabin's grave, the cameras caught it, but missed what he muttered under his breath. We started to write something new, and now the page is torn. Over the next few years, violence returned, trust dissolved. Arafat was pulled in every direction between peacemakers, militants, politicians, and ghosts. He began keeping a Quran on his nightstand, next to a worn notebook. In it, he wrote names: children killed, mothers displaced, fathers imprisoned. Every night, he read those names out loud. When asked why, he said, "Because someone must remember them. If not me, who?" He was aging, slower, weaker. But when he spoke of Palestine, his eyes still lit up. "We are not just fighting for land," he said once. "We are fighting for a place where no child grows up thinking the world forgot them." The new millennium arrived with fire. In 2000, the Second Intifada erupted. Stones were thrown, bullets answered. Blood returned to the streets, like it had been waiting there all along. And again, eyes turned to Arafat. Some begged him to condemn the uprising. Others demanded he lead it. But Arafat stood in the middle, again, like a man trying to hold two rivers apart with his bare hands. In public, he spoke of patience. In private, he wept. Not for politics, but for the young faces he saw on every news screen. He once told his closest advisor, "I've spent my whole life trying to bring them dignity, and now I watch them die with rocks in their hands." The world grew colder toward him. Washington turned its back. Israel branded him a manipulator. Even his own people began asking, has he lost control? But what they didn't see was the small room in Ramallah, where Arafat lived like a prisoner. In 2002, Israeli tanks surrounded his compound, his home, his office, his life, reduced to one crumbling building without electricity, water, or sunlight. There was no bathroom, no phone, just flickering radios and flickering hope. He slept on a cot. A tin bowl held his meals. A single candle lit his prayers. And yet, when asked by a journalist what kept him from giving up, he replied, "I have already died many times, but I still wake up breathing. That is not my doing." That's the line few understood. Arafat did not believe he had survived by chance. He believed he was carrying something, placed in his hands by a will higher than politics. One night during heavy shelling, his guard rushed in and said, "You need to move. They've targeted this wing." Arafat simply turned the page of the Quran he was reading and said, "I am already where I was meant to be." Outside, children painted his face on crumbling walls. Some cursed him. Some cried for him. Inside, he wrote letters. One was addressed to a child named Faisal, a boy who had lost both parents in the uprising. It read, "If I am alive when you grow up, find me. If I am not, remember this. Your pain is not your fault. Your courage is not invisible, and your name belongs to the land, not the war." By 2004, Yasser Arafat's body had grown frail. He barely ate. His voice, once thunderous, had become a whisper barely louder than the flicker of the candlelight that kept his room aglow. His doctors noticed the decline. His inner circle begged him to seek treatment abroad. He resisted, not out of pride, but out of fear. "If I leave," he said, "they won't let me return. I'll die in a land that is not mine." It wasn't paranoia, it was prophecy. But eventually, the pain became too sharp, the weakness too visible. He could no longer write, could barely walk. France offered medical care, and reluctantly, tired, pale, and nearly unconscious, he left Ramallah. As the helicopter rose, someone whispered, "Will he ever come back?" No one answered. In Paris, his room was white, sterile, clean in all the ways Ramallah never could be. But it was also silent. No voices in Arabic, no calls for prayer, no olive trees outside the window, just monitors, machines, and time. In his final moments, no cameras rolled, no grand speeches were made, but one nurse later said that in a brief moment of clarity, Arafat opened his eyes and whispered one word, "Ummi," mother. It was the only word he said that day, and perhaps the most honest one of his life. He died on November 11th, 2004. He died without seeing peace, without returning to Jerusalem, without planting the olive tree he once promised in front of the UN. But something strange happened after his death. For days, silence. The gunfire stopped. The chants stopped. Even his critics paused. Even his enemies hesitated. Because whether loved or hated, the world had to admit this man carried a people in his hands for decades and never once dropped them, even when those same hands trembled. They buried him in Ramallah, in a temporary grave. Why temporary? Because he left instructions, "Bury me in Ramallah for now, but when Jerusalem is free, move me there. I have waited all my life. I can wait a little longer." What remains when a man dies, but the cause he carried lives on? In the days after Arafat's burial, the world returned to its noise. New leaders emerged. Old rivalries resurfaced. The flags waved, but without rhythm. And yet somewhere in a refugee camp, a boy sat under a flickering street lamp, sketching a face he'd never seen in person. A man with tired eyes and a checkered scarf. "Who is that?" his little sister asked. "They say he was the only one who didn't leave." That's how Yasser Arafat lives on. Not through speeches, not through politics, but through stories whispered in alleyways, painted on crumbling walls, and kept alive in the verses of worn-out prayer books. He was not perfect. He was flawed, fierce, stubborn. But he never stopped believing that a forgotten people still had a name. One of the last letters discovered in his study, never sent, never signed, was addressed only to the generation I'll never meet. It read, "You will inherit wounds I could not heal. You will walk streets I could not reclaim. But if I gave you anything, I hope it is this: the belief that you are worthy of more than survival, and that God does not forget the voices of the faithful, even when the world does." That was Arafat's legacy, not carved into monuments, but etched into the spaces between memory and meaning. He was born without a mother. He died without a homeland. But in between, he carried a nation on his shoulders. And whether you loved him or cursed his name, you must admit, he walked through fire and never let go of the olive branch. Thank you for spending your evening with us. This story was not about politics or sides. It was about a soul who bore the weight of millions, hoping that someday, somehow, the burden would blossom into peace. Tonight, may we remember that leadership is often lonely, that resistance can be sacred, and that God sometimes places a thorn in a man's path, not to wound him, but to remind him to walk carefully, humbly, and with faith. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.